The coming of socialism was to be the leap from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. It was to bring economic freedom, without which the political freedom already gained was not worth having. Only socialism was capable of effecting the consummation of the age-long struggle for freedom, in which the attainment of political freedom was but a first step. The subtle change in meaning to which the word freedom was subjected, in order that this argument should sound plausible, is important. To the great apostles of political freedom, the word had meant freedom from coercion, freedom from the arbitrary power of other men, release from the ties which left the individual no choice but obedience to the orders of a superior to whom he was attached. The new freedom promised, however, was to be freedom from necessity, release from the compulsion of the circumstances which inevitably limit the range of choice of all of us, although for some, very much more than for others. Before man could be truly free, the despotism of physical want had to be broken, the restraints of the economic system relaxed. Freedom, in this sense, is, of course, merely another name for power or wealth. The characteristic confusion of freedom with power, which we shall meet again and again throughout this discussion, is too big a subject to be thoroughly examined here. As old as socialism itself, it is so closely allied with it that almost 70 years ago, a French scholar, discussing its Saint-Simonian origins, was led to say that this theory of liberty est issu tout le socialisme, Paul Janet, Saint-Simon et le Saint-Simonisme, 1878, page 26. Note. The most explicit defender of this confusion is, significantly, the leading philosopher of American left-wingism, John Dewey, according to whom liberty is the effective power to do specific things, so that the demand for liberty is demand for power. Liberty and Social Control, Social Frontier, November 1935, page 41. Yet, although the promises of this new freedom were often coupled with irresponsible promises of a great increase in material wealth in a socialist society, it was not from such an absolute conquest of the niggardliness of nature that economic freedom was expected. What the promise really amounted to was that the great existing disparities in the range of choice of different people were to disappear. The demand for the new freedom was thus only another name for the old demand for an equal distribution of wealth. But the new name gave the socialists another word in common with the liberals, and they exploited it to the full. And, although the word was used in a different sense by the two groups, few people noticed this, and still fewer asked themselves whether the two kinds of freedom promised could really be combined. There can be no doubt that the promise of greater freedom has become one of the most effective weapons of socialist propaganda, and that the belief that socialism would bring freedom is genuine and sincere. But this would only heighten the tragedy if it should prove that what was promised to us as the road to freedom was in fact the high road to servitude. Unquestionably, the promise of more freedom was responsible for luring more and more liberals along the socialist road, for blinding them to the conflict which exists between the basic principles of socialism and liberalism, and for often enabling socialists to usurp the very name of the old party of freedom. Socialism was embraced by the greater part of the intelligentsia as the apparent heir of the liberal tradition. Therefore, it is not surprising that, to them, the idea of socialism's leading to the opposite of liberty should appear inconceivable. In recent years, however, the old apprehensions of the unforeseen consequences of socialism have once more been strongly voiced from the most unexpected quarters. Observer after observer, in spite of the contrary expectation with which he approached his subject, has been impressed with the extraordinary similarity, in many respects, of the conditions under fascism and communism. While progressives in England and elsewhere were still deluding themselves that communism and fascism represented opposite poles, more and more people began to ask themselves whether these new tyrannies were not the outcome of the same tendencies. Even communists must have been somewhat shaken by such testimonies as that of Max Eastman, Lenin's old friend, who found himself compelled to admit that, Instead of being better, Stalinism is worse than fascism, more ruthless, barbarous, unjust, immoral, anti-democratic, unredeemed by any hope or scruple, and that it is better described as super-fascist. And when we find the same author recognizing that Stalinism is socialism, in the sense of being an inevitable, although unforeseen political accompaniment of the nationalization and collectivization which he had relied upon as part of his plan for erecting a classless society, his conclusion clearly achieves wider significance. Stalin's Russia and the Crisis of Socialism, 1940, page 82. Mr. Eastman's case is perhaps the most remarkable. Yet he is by no means the first or the only sympathetic observer of the Russian experiment to form similar conclusions. Several years earlier, W. H. Chamberlain, who in 12 years in Russia as an American correspondent had seen all his ideals shattered, summed up the conclusions of his studies there and in Germany and Italy in the statement that socialism is certain to prove, in the beginning at least, the road not to freedom, but to dictatorship and counter-dictatorships, to civil war of the fiercest kind. Socialism achieved and maintained by democratic means seems definitely to belong to the world of utopias. A False Utopia, 1937, pages 202 to 203. Similarly, a British writer, F. A. Voigt, after many years of close observation of developments in Europe as a foreign correspondent, concludes that Marxism has led to fascism and National Socialism because, in all essentials, it is fascism and National Socialism. Unto Caesar, 1939, page 95. And Walter Lippmann has arrived at the conviction that the generation to which we belong is now learning from experience what happens when men retreat from freedom to a coercive organization of their affairs. Though they promise themselves a more abundant life, they must, in practice, renounce it. As the organized direction increases, the variety of ends must give way to uniformity. That is the nemesis of the planned society and the authoritarian principle in human affairs. Atlantic Monthly, November 1936, page 552. Many more similar statements from people in a position to judge might be selected from publications of recent years, particularly from those by men who, as citizens of the now totalitarian countries, have lived through the transformation and have been forced by their experience to revise many cherished beliefs. We shall quote, as one more example, a German writer who expresses the same conclusion, perhaps more justly than those already quoted. The complete collapse of the belief in the attainability of freedom and equality through Marxism, writes Peter Drucker, has forced Russia to travel the same road toward a totalitarian, purely negative, non-economic society of unfreedom and inequality which Germany has been following. Not that communism and fascism are essentially the same. Fascism is the stage reached after communism has proved an illusion, and it has proved as much an illusion in Stalinist Russia as in pre-Hitler Germany. The End of Economic Man, 1939, page 230. No less significant is the intellectual history of many of the Nazi and fascist leaders. Everyone who has watched the growth of these movements in Italy or in Germany has been struck by the number of leading men, from Mussolini downward, and not excluding Laval and Quisling, who began as socialists and ended as fascists or Nazis. An illuminating account of the intellectual history of many of the fascist leaders will be found in Robert Michel's, himself a former Marxist-fascist, Sozialismus und Faschismus, Munich, 1925, Book 2, pages 264 to 266 and 311 to 312. And what is true of the leaders is even more true of the rank and file of the movement. The relative ease with which a young communist could be converted into a Nazi, or vice versa, was generally known in Germany, best of all to the propagandists of the two parties. Many a university teacher during the 1930s has seen English and American students return from the continent uncertain whether they were communists or Nazis, and certain only that they hated Western liberal civilization. It is true, of course, that in Germany before 1933, and in Italy before 1922, communists and Nazis or fascists clashed more frequently with each other than with other parties. They competed for the support of the same type of mind and reserved for each other the hatred of the heretic. But their practice showed how closely they are related. To both, the real enemy, the man with whom they had nothing in common, and whom they could not hope to convince, is the liberal of the old type, while to the Nazi, the communist, and to the communist, the Nazi, and to both the socialist are potential recruits who are made of the right timber, although they have listened to false prophets. They both know that there can be no compromise between them and those who really believe in individual freedom. Lest this be doubted by people misled by official propaganda from either side, let me quote one more statement from an authority that ought not to be suspect. In an article under the significant title of The Rediscovery of Liberalism, Professor Eduard Heimann, one of the leaders of German religious socialism, writes, "Hitlerism proclaims itself as both true democracy and true socialism. And the terrible truth is that there is a grain of truth for such claims, an infinitesimal grain to be sure, but at any rate enough to serve as a basis for such fantastic distortions. Hitlerism even goes so far as to claim the role of protector of Christianity. And the terrible truth is that even this gross misinterpretation is able to make some impression. But one fact stands out with perfect clarity in all the fog. Hitler has never claimed to represent true liberalism. Liberalism, then, has the distinction of being the doctrine most hated by Hitler." Social Research, Volume 8, Number 4, November 1941. It deserves to be recalled in this connection that, whatever may have been his reasons, Hitler thought it expedient to declare in one of his public speeches as late as February 1941 that, basically, National Socialism and Marxism are the same. Cf. The Bulletin of International News, published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Volume 18, Number 5, page 269. It should be added that this hatred had little occasion to show itself in practice merely because, by the time Hitler came to power, liberalism was to all intents and purposes dead in Germany, and it was socialism that had killed it. While to many who have watched the transition from socialism to fascism at close quarters, the connection between the two systems has become increasingly obvious. In the democracies, the majority of people still believe that socialism and freedom can be combined. There can be no doubt that most socialists here still believe profoundly in the liberal ideal of freedom, and that they would recoil if they became convinced that the realization of their program would mean the destruction of freedom. So little is the problem yet seen, so easily do the most irreconcilable ideals still live together, that we can still hear such contradictions in terms as individualist socialism seriously discussed. If this is the state of mind which makes us drift into a new world, nothing can be more urgent than that we should seriously examine the real significance of the evolution that has taken place elsewhere, although our conclusions will only confirm the apprehensions which others have already expressed. The reasons why this development cannot be regarded as accidental will not appear without a rather full examination of the main aspects of this transformation of social life. That democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something so utterly different that few of those who now wish it would be prepared to accept the consequences. Many will not believe until the connection has been laid bare in all its aspects.